Finland did not fall into civil war because it was weak. It fell into civil war because it believed it had already won. In December 1917, independence arrived with astonishing speed. For more than a century, Finland had existed under foreign rule, first as part of Sweden, then as an autonomous Grand Duchy under the Russian Empire. The struggle for self-determination had been long, cautious, and often restrained. But when the Russian state collapsed under the weight of revolution, the opportunity appeared almost overnight. Independence was declared. The empire that had governed Finland was gone. For the first time in modern history, the country stood alone. And many believed that was enough. There was a widespread assumption that once foreign power disappeared, the internal tensions that had shaped Finnish society would soften on their own, that the removal of an external ruler would allow the nation to breathe, to settle, to finally find unity in freedom. This belief was not naive. It was understandable. It had logic, and it was shared across social classes, political parties, and regions. But it was wrong. Within weeks of independence, Finland was already coming apart. By the time the winter of 1918 tightened its grip on the country, Finns were no longer asking how to build a new nation together. They were asking who would control it and at what cost. The civil war that followed was not supposed to happen. But once it began, it revealed just how fragile independence had been from the very start. To understand why Finland collapsed so quickly into violence, we have to look beyond January 1918. The roots of the conflict were older, deeper, and far more uncomfortable than the idea of a sudden political failure. They were embedded in everyday life. For decades before independence, Finland had been a deeply unequal society. Although it possessed a strong sense of national identity and a relatively advanced administrative system, social and economic power was unevenly distributed. Most Finns lived in the countryside, working as tenant farmers, crofters, or agricultural labourers. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of a relatively small elite, and for many rural families, life was defined by uncertainty, seasonal work, and dependence on landowners. In the cities, industrialization brought new opportunities, but also new hardships. Factories expanded, particularly in the south, drawing workers into urban centres where wages were low, working hours were long, and living conditions were often poor. Housing shortages were common, food prices fluctuated, job security was minimal. At the same time, political power lagged behind social change. While Finland had made remarkable advances in political representation in the early 20th century, including universal suffrage and full political rights for women, those reforms did not immediately translate into material improvements for the working population. Parliament existed, but it often felt distant. Laws were debated, but daily life remained harsh. This gap between political promise and lived reality created frustration. Over time, it hardened into resentment. Class divisions were not theoretical. They were visible in where people lived, how they dressed, what they ate, and how secure their futures felt. They shaped conversations, expectations, and fears long before anyone picked up a weapon. Then came the First World War. Although Finland was not a battlefield in the early years of the conflict, the war disrupted trade, strained food supplies, and increased economic pressure across the country. Inflation rose, shortages became common, trust in authorities weakened as people struggled to meet basic needs. And when the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, the foundations of power that had governed Finland for generations collapsed almost instantly. For many Finns, the fall of the Russian state felt like liberation, but it also removed the final layer of authority that had kept internal disputes contained. Independence arrived into a vacuum. The new Finnish state inherited borders, institutions, and expectations, but it lacked something far more important. It lacked trust. There was no shared understanding, of what independence should mean in practice. For some, it meant continuity, order, and the preservation of existing structures under national control. For others, it meant radical change, social justice, and a complete reorganization of society. Both visions claimed legitimacy. Both believed independence had validated their position. Neither trusted the other to wait. As political paralysis set in, people began to organize outside the state. Local security groups formed across the country, initially as a response to uncertainty and fear. In working-class districts and industrial towns, workers organized armed groups to protect factories, neighborhoods, and food supplies. In rural areas and among the middle and upper classes, similar groups formed with the stated aim of maintaining order and preventing revolutionary chaos. At first, these formations were often informal and defensive in nature. But as the months passed, their purpose shifted. Training intensified. Weapons were acquired. Lines were drawn. What had begun as a struggle over policy and reform was becoming a struggle over power itself. By the end of 1917, Finland had two competing visions of authority, each backed by armed supporters, each convinced that the other represented an existential threat to the future of the nation. The tragedy was that both sides believed they were acting to save Finland. Fear accelerated everything. Workers feared that independence would change nothing, that the old elite would simply replace foreign rulers and continue to dominate political and economic life. Landowners and conservatives feared that social unrest would spiral into revolution, destroying property, order, and the state itself. These fears fed each other. Every rumor of violence confirmed suspicion. Every delay in political decision-making deepened mistrust. Every armed patrol, no matter how defensive it claimed to be, was interpreted as preparation for attack. The belief that the other side would strike first became widespread, and once that belief took hold, restraint vanished. By January 1918, the country was effectively split, not by borders drawn on a map, but by loyalty, fear, and expectation. Southern industrial regions leaned toward revolutionary change. Northern and rural areas largely supported the preservation of order under conservative leadership. Railways, food depots, factories, and government buildings became symbols of control. Whoever held them would shape the future of the nation. There was no formal declaration of war. There was no single moment when Finland collectively realized what was happening. Instead, violence crept in quietly. Arrests, seizures, armed patrols, shots fired in the night, then escalation. What followed would be brief, brutal, and transformative. The Finnish Civil War would last only a few months, but it would alter the country's political culture, memory, and identity for generations. Independence had promised unity. What it delivered was a test Finland was not prepared to face, and the price of that misjudgment would be paid in blood. By the middle of January 1918, Finland was no longer governed by law in any meaningful sense. Parliament still existed. Decrees were still issued. Official authority had not formally collapsed. But power had shifted elsewhere, into the hands of those willing to enforce their vision with force. Across the country, armed groups began to move openly. In the industrial south, workers' guards took control of factories, railway stations, and municipal buildings. Red flags appeared above city halls. Revolutionary committees declared themselves the legitimate representatives of the people, insisting that independence without social justice was meaningless. In the north, white guards mobilized just as openly. They secured arms depots, communication lines, and key transportation routes. Their leaders framed the situation as an emergency, a moment when the state had to be defended from internal collapse. Each side believed it was acting to prevent catastrophe. Each side believed the other had already chosen violence, When fighting finally broke out in late January, it did not begin with a single decisive clash. Instead, it unfolded as a series of local sieges and confrontations that quickly spiraled beyond control. Railway lines were among the first targets. Whoever controlled them could move troops, supplies, and information. Stations were occupied, sometimes without resistance, sometimes after brief but deadly exchanges. Factories followed, not only because they symbolized industrial power, but because they employed thousands of workers whose loyalty mattered. Cities began to divide internally. Streets became boundaries. Neighborhoods became strongholds. The war arrived unevenly, but once it did, it arrived fast. The Reds established their center of power in southern Finland, where industry, population density, and political support gave them an initial advantage. Helsinki, Tampere, and other major cities fell under Red control. A revolutionary government was declared, promising sweeping reforms that had been debated for years but never realized. Land redistribution, workers' control, an end to elite dominance. For many supporters, this was not about ideology imported from abroad. It was about dignity, survival, and the belief that independence had to mean more than a change of flag. The Whites, meanwhile, consolidated their forces in the north. Their leadership structure was clearer, their command more centralized. Many of their officers had prior military experience, either from service in the Russian army or from training abroad. Discipline, coordination, and hierarchy gave them an advantage that would become increasingly important as the war progressed. Both sides faced shortages. Weapons were scarce. Ammunition was limited. Training was uneven. But the imbalance was already visible. The Reds had numbers and early momentum. The Whites had organization and leadership. Foreign influence deepened the divide. The Reds received limited support from Bolshevik Russia, primarily in the form of weapons, advisors, and ideological encouragement. This support strengthened the Whites' belief that they were not merely fighting fellow Finns, but resisting a revolutionary tide that threatened to consume the country. The Whites, in turn, sought help from Germany. Germany saw Finland as strategically valuable and politically aligned. Weapons and training began to flow. Later, German troops themselves would intervene directly, a decision that would shape both the outcome of the war and Finland's future position in Europe. These alliances did not cause the war, but they intensified it. What might have remained a short-lived internal conflict hardened into something far more decisive. As February turned into March, the fighting escalated. The battle for Tampere marked a turning point. Tampere was one of Finland's most important industrial centres and a stronghold of Red support. When White forces advanced on the city, they encountered determined resistance. The fighting that followed was among the fiercest of the entire war. Urban combat transformed the conflict. Artillery was used against dense neighbourhoods. Streets were fought over block by block. Snipers fired from factory roofs and apartment windows. Civilians were caught between advancing units and retreating defenders. The distinction between front lines and civilian spaces collapsed. When Tampere finally fell in early April, the cost was staggering. Thousands had been killed or wounded. Large numbers of Red fighters were captured. The psychological impact of the defeat rippled across the country. For the Reds, it marked the beginning of the end. For the Whites, it confirmed that victory was possible. But the brutality of the fighting had already crossed a line. This was no longer a struggle that could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. The violence had taken on its own momentum. As White forces advanced southward, the war grew increasingly personal. This was not a conflict between strangers. It was fought between neighbours, co-workers, and sometimes even family members. Old disputes resurfaced under the cover of ideology. Accusations replaced evidence. Fear justified preemptive violence. Executions became common on both sides. Often they were carried out hastily, without formal trials. Suspected collaborators, informants, or enemies were killed to prevent future resistance. In some cases, these acts were framed as military necessity. In others, they were unmistakably acts of revenge. The war stripped away restraint. As supply lines collapsed and food shortages worsened, desperation set in. Hunger weakened morale. Disease spread among troops and civilians alike. Communication broke down. Rumors filled the void left by reliable information. By April 1918, the balance of power shifted decisively. German troops landed in southern Finland, well-trained and well-equipped. Their arrival changed the course of the war almost immediately. Red defences crumbled under coordinated offensives that they were unprepared to counter. Helsinki fell quickly. Resistance collapsed across the south. By early May, organised fighting had effectively ended. The Whites had won. But the end of combat did not bring an end to suffering. What followed would prove even more devastating than the war itself. Tens of thousands of Red fighters and supporters were detained in camps across the country. Some were prisoners of war, others were civilians accused of collaboration or sympathy. Conditions in the camps were dire. Food was scarce, shelter was inadequate, medical care was minimal. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded facilities. Many prisoners were never formally charged. They were held indefinitely, waiting for decisions that came slowly, if at all. Starvation and illness killed thousands. Executions continued in the aftermath of victory, justified as measures to secure the state and prevent renewed rebellion. In reality, they extended the violence long after the battlefield had fallen silent. The human cost of the civil war was immense. Approximately 36,000 people died as a result of the conflict. A significant number of those deaths occurred after the fighting had already ended. For a nation of just over 3 million, the impact was profound. Almost every community was touched. Almost every family carried loss. Independence had been achieved. But Finland emerged from the war deeply scarred, divided not only by ideology, but by memory. The belief that independence would unite the nation had collapsed completely. What remained was the far more difficult task of rebuilding trust in a country that had just torn itself apart. And that task would take far longer than anyone expected. When the fighting ended in May 1918, Finland was not ready to face what it had done to itself. The guns fell silent, but the war did not end. It simply moved out of sight. Victory had given the Whites control of the state, but it had not given the country closure. What followed was not reconciliation, but management. The immediate priority was to secure order, eliminate perceived threats, and prevent the conflict from reigniting. Justice, in the broader sense, could wait. For tens of thousands of defeated Reds, that waiting took place behind a barbed wire. Across Finland, prison camps filled with men and women accused of supporting the revolutionary cause. Some had fought. Others had cooked meals, guarded warehouses, or simply lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. Guilt was often assumed, rather than proven. The legal system struggled to process the sheer number of detainees, and in many cases, it never truly did. Conditions in the camps reflected the state of the nation itself. Food shortages were widespread. Medical supplies were limited. Guards were often poorly trained and deeply embittered by the violence they had witnessed. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded enclosures where sanitation was minimal and hope was scarce. Death became routine. By the summer of 1918, more people were dying in prison camps than had been killed in combat during the war itself. Starvation, illness, and neglect claimed thousands of lives. Executions continued as well, carried out under emergency laws that blurred the line between punishment and vengeance. The war had officially ended. The violence had not. For those outside the camps, Daily life resumed unevenly. Farms needed tending. Factories needed workers. The economy had to function. But beneath the surface, the country was fractured. Entire communities were marked by loss. Families waited for relatives who never returned. Children grew up without fathers. Widows struggled to survive in a society that was eager to move forward, but unwilling to look back. Silence became the default response. Public memory of the war quickly took on a selective shape. Official narratives emphasized the preservation of order and the defense of independence. White sacrifice was honored. White leadership was celebrated. The war was framed as a necessary struggle against chaos. The experiences of the Reds were pushed aside. They were not erased, but they were contained. Their suffering was acknowledged only cautiously, if at all. Speaking openly about the war, especially from the perspective of the defeated, carried social and sometimes legal consequences. The line between remembrance and accusation was thin, and many chose not to cross it. This imbalance shaped how the war was remembered for decades. In schools, the conflict was taught briefly, often without depth. In public ceremonies, commemoration focused on unity rather than division. Monuments told partial stories. Graves remained unmarked. At home, memory persisted quietly. Kitchen tables became sites of history. Stories were passed down in fragments, shaped by fear and discretion. What children learned about 1918 depended largely on which side their family had been on, and what their parents felt safe enough to say. As time passed, the silence hardened into habit. Yet the war's influence did not fade. It reshaped Finland's political instincts in ways that were subtle but profound. The trauma of internal violence created a deep aversion to extremism. Political movements that embraced radical solutions were viewed with suspicion. Leaders understood how quickly rhetoric could escalate into force, and they governed accordingly. Compromise, once seen as weakness by some, became a survival strategy. Coalition governments became the norm. Parliamentary procedures were designed to slow decision-making rather than accelerate it. The goal was not efficiency, but stability. These choices were not theoretical. They were shaped by memory. The Civil War also altered how Finns understood democracy itself. No longer as something guaranteed by independence alone, but as a fragile system that required constant care. The collapse of trust in 1918 had shown how easily institutions could fail when belief in shared rules disappeared. Rebuilding that trust was slow, uneven work. Reforms were introduced gradually. Land laws were adjusted to reduce rural inequality. Labour protections improved working conditions. Political participation expanded. None of these changes erased the pain of the past, but they addressed some of the grievances that had fueled the conflict. Importantly, they were implemented without reopening the wounds of the war. Finland did not pursue immediate reconciliation in the modern sense. There were no national truth commissions, no formal acknowledgements of collective wrongdoing. Instead, reconciliation unfolded quietly through shared experience and mutual restraint. This approach was tested repeatedly. In the 1920s and 1930s, Finland faced economic instability and political radicalization. Extremist movements emerged, drawing inspiration from developments elsewhere in Europe. Once again, the country stood at a crossroads. This time, the memory of 1918 acted as a brake. Political leaders, regardless of ideology, understood the cost of allowing polarization to spiral out of control. When extremist groups challenged the authority of the state, they were confronted decisively, but without descending into mass violence. The institutions held. The lesson of the Civil War was being applied, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. Then came another, far greater test. In 1939, Finland was invaded by the Soviet Union. The Winter War forced the nation to mobilize under conditions of extreme pressure. Once again, Survival was at stake. What followed was remarkable. Former Reds and Whites fought side by side. Old divisions did not vanish, but they no longer defined the nation's response. The shared experience of external threat reshaped identity in a way independence alone had not. Unity, the thing Finland had hoped independence would deliver in 1917, emerged instead under fire more than 20 years later. Not because the past had been forgotten, but because it had been endured. After the Second World War, the silence surrounding the Civil War slowly began to lift. Historians revisited the period with greater openness. Writers and artists explored perspectives that had long been marginalized. Archives were opened. Conversations expanded. The narrative grew more complex. The war was no longer described simply as a struggle between order and chaos. It came to be understood as a collective failure of trust, a moment when fear and inequality overwhelmed the mechanisms designed to contain them. This shift did not absolve responsibility. Atrocities were acknowledged. Suffering was recognized on both sides. The goal was not to equalize guilt, but to humanize the past. By the late 20th century, Finland had developed a relationship with its civil war that was neither celebratory nor evasive. It was cautious, reflective, and deliberately uncomfortable. Perhaps that discomfort is the point. The Finnish Civil War remains one of the shortest conflicts in the nation's history, but its consequences are among the longest lasting. It shaped how Finland governs, how it remembers, and how it understands the dangers of division. It revealed that independence does not automatically create unity. It exposes fractures that must be confronted, not assumed away. The war forced Finland to confront a reality it had hoped to avoid. That freedom is not a solution in itself. It is a responsibility. And in 1918, Finland learned just how heavy that responsibility could be. The Finnish Civil War did not end with reconciliation. It ended with exhaustion. The country had reached a point where it could no longer afford to continue tearing itself apart, but it was not yet capable of facing what it had done. What followed was not healing in the emotional sense, but stabilization. Finland chose survival over reckoning, continuity over confrontation. That choice shaped everything that came next. In the years after 1918, Finland rebuilt its institutions with a clear understanding of their fragility. The memory of collapse was never far away. Law, order, and procedure were no longer abstract ideals. They were safeguards against repetition. Politics became cautious, sometimes deliberately slow. Coalition governments replaced decisive majorities. Compromise was no longer treated as weakness, but as necessity. Disagreements were expected, but escalation was not. This political culture did not emerge from theory. It was born from trauma. The Civil War had demonstrated how quickly ideology could turn neighbors into enemies when trust disappeared. That lesson settled deep into the national consciousness, even when it was not openly discussed. The result was a society deeply skeptical of absolutes. Finnish politics, after 1918, rarely embraced grand visions without hesitation. Promises of total transformation were treated with suspicion. Leaders spoke carefully, aware that words could inflame as easily as they could inspire. This restraint was not passivity. It was learned discipline. It also extended beyond politics into everyday life. Public behavior favored moderation. Social norms discouraged overt displays of extremism. Conflict, when it arose, was expected to be contained. These tendencies are often described as cultural traits. In reality, they were historical adaptations. The Civil War had exposed how thin the line between order and chaos truly was. Finland adjusted accordingly. As decades passed, the war's presence faded from daily conversation, but not from institutional memory. It influenced how laws were written, how power was distributed, and how dissent was managed. When radical movements appeared in the interwar years, Finland responded with firmness, but also restraint. Unlike many European states, it did not allow political violence to become normalized again. Extremism was confronted before it could metastasize. The memory of 1918 made tolerance for such movements limited. This balance was tested repeatedly, most dramatically during the Second World War. When Finland faced invasion in 1939, the country mobilized under conditions far more severe than those of 1918. Resources were scarce, survival was uncertain, the external threat was overwhelming, yet the state held. Former divisions did not disappear overnight, but they no longer dictated loyalty. Men who would have faced each other across barricades 20 years earlier now stood in the same defensive lines. The Winter War did not erase the Civil War, but it reframed it. Unity, which independence had failed to deliver, emerged under the pressure of shared danger. The lesson was unmistakable. External threat could forge cohesion. Internal mistrust could destroy it. Finland remembered that distinction. After the war, the country entered a period defined by balance. Foreign policy demanded careful navigation. Domestic policy demanded stability. The margin for error was narrow. Once again, the instincts formed in 1918 guided decision-making. Avoid polarization. Preserve institutions. De-escalate conflict before it becomes irreversible. These principles were not celebrated. They were practiced. Over time, public discussion of the Civil War slowly expanded. Distance made honesty possible. The generation that had fought the war aged. Their children began to ask questions that could not be answered with silence alone. Historians revisited the period with greater access to archives and fewer political constraints. Writers explored the emotional cost of the conflict. Artists depicted the war not as heroic struggle, but as human catastrophe. The narrative grew more complex. The Reds were no longer reduced to caricatures. The Whites were no longer portrayed as morally unambiguous. Responsibility was distributed across structures, decisions, and failures of leadership. The war came to be understood not as an unavoidable explosion, but as a convergence of conditions that could have been addressed earlier, differently, more carefully. This shift mattered. It allowed Finland to integrate the Civil War into its national story without mythologizing it. The conflict was acknowledged as foundational, but not glorified. It became a lesson rather than a legend. Memory was reshaped into restraint. Today, the Civil War is taught openly in schools. Memorials acknowledge victims on both sides. Public discourse no longer avoids the subject, but it approaches it with care. There is no celebration, there is no reenactment, only recognition. This approach reflects a broader Finnish understanding of power, that it must be handled cautiously, that authority without legitimacy collapses, that force resolves little and scars deeply. These conclusions were not inevitable, they were earned. The Finnish Civil War forced the country to confront the cost of believing that freedom alone guarantees unity. Independence removed external control, but it did not resolve internal contradictions. Those contradictions demanded negotiation, reform, and patience. When those tools failed or were abandoned, violence filled the gap. The aftermath showed that recovery required the opposite approach: time, reform, restraint, not vengeance, not denial. The war also reshaped how Finland understood national identity. Instead of building its story solely around victory or heroism, the country carried a quieter awareness of vulnerability. This awareness became a strength. It discouraged arrogance. It fostered caution. It created space for pluralism without illusion. Finland did not emerge from 1918 as a unified nation. It emerged as a nation aware of how easily unity can be lost. That awareness guided it through the Cold War, through economic crises, and through the pressures of modern globalization. The Civil War's influence is rarely visible, but it is persistent. It lives in institutions designed to slow power, in political language that avoids extremes, in a public culture wary of division. These are not coincidences, they are consequences. The Civil War was brief, its shadow was long, and it remains a reminder that nations are not held together by declarations alone, but by the daily work of trust. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, Finland had survived events that should have broken it. Independence, civil war, invasion, territorial loss, political pressure from powers far larger than itself. Yet through all of it, the memory of 1918 remained quietly present, not as a triumph or a rallying cry, but as a caution embedded in how the country understood itself. The Finnish Civil War was never allowed to become a heroic myth, and that may be its most important legacy. Where other nations built identity around victory or conquest, Finland carried something different. A memory of collapse. A reminder that the greatest danger it ever faced did not come from outside its borders, but from within. This understanding shaped how power was treated. Authority was not romanticized. Leaders were not elevated beyond criticism. Institutions were designed to slow momentum rather than accelerate it, to absorb disagreement rather than amplify it. The instinct was simple, but hard-earned. Never again allow fear to outrun trust. This instinct did not make Finland immune to conflict. Disagreements continued. Politics remained contentious. Economic pressure created frustration. Social change generated resistance. But the threshold for violence was never crossed again. The line had been drawn in blood, and everyone knew where it lay. The Civil War also reshaped how Finns understood justice. After 1918, the country learned that punishment without legitimacy only deepens division, that humiliation breeds resentment, that silencing wounds does not heal them. Over time, this understanding translated into a political culture that valued inclusion over exclusion, dialogue over decree, and reform over rupture. These choices were not always fast, they were not always clean, but they were deliberate, and they worked. When Finland navigated the Cold War, it did so with an acute awareness of internal cohesion. The leadership understood that survival depended as much on domestic stability as on foreign policy balance. Polarization was not merely a political inconvenience, it was a threat. This mindset can be traced directly back to 1918. The Civil War had shown how quickly a society could fracture when competing visions of legitimacy replaced shared rules. Every major decision afterward carried that memory, whether acknowledged or not. Even today, the echoes remain. They appear in Finland's reluctance to glorify political violence, in its careful handling of dissent, in its emphasis on consensus, even when consensus is uncomfortable. These traits are sometimes misunderstood from the outside. They are described as cultural quirks or as signs of excessive caution. In truth, they are survival mechanisms. The Civil War taught Finland something few nations learn without repeating the mistake: that unity is not created by victory. It is created by restraint. It is tempting to look back on 1918 and search for inevitability, to frame the war as the unavoidable result of class struggle, ideology, or historical forces beyond human control. But that framing misses something essential. The Finnish Civil War was not preordained. It emerged from choices made under pressure, from assumptions left unchallenged, from the belief that independence itself would resolve tensions that had been allowed to deepen for decades. That belief was shared widely, and it failed catastrophically. Independence removed an external ruler, but it also removed a buffer. It exposed inequalities, fears, and unresolved conflicts that had been managed, postponed, or ignored under imperial authority. When that authority vanished, The responsibility to govern fell suddenly and completely on a society that was not yet ready to govern itself together. The result was violence, not because Finns were uniquely divided, not because the nation lacked character, but because trust had not yet been built to replace control. The tragedy of 1918 lies not only in the lives lost, but in the realization that the war could have been avoided, or at least mitigated, had the warning signs been recognized earlier. Hunger, landlessness, political paralysis, fear masquerading as certainty. These were not invisible forces. They were present in everyday life, and when independence arrived, it magnified them rather than dissolving them. Yet the story does not end there. What followed the Civil War was not a descent into permanent division, but a long, uneven process of learning. Learning how to disagree without dehumanizing, learning how to reform without destroying, learning how to remember without reopening wounds. This process took decades. It required patience from those who had suffered most. It required humility from those who had won. It was imperfect. It was incomplete. But it was real. Today, Finland's civil war is no longer hidden. It is studied, discussed, and acknowledged as a defining moment in the nation's history. Memorials recognize victims on both sides. Archives are open, conversations continue. There is no attempt to erase the past, nor is there an attempt to redeem it. Instead, the war stands as a warning embedded in national memory, a reminder of how quickly belief can turn into certainty and certainty into violence, a reminder that independence is not an endpoint, but a beginning, a reminder that freedom without trust is fragile. The Finnish Civil War lasted only a few months, but it forced Finland to confront questions that many nations avoid for generations. Who belongs? Who decides? How power should be limited? How disagreement should be contained? These questions did not disappear when the fighting ended. They became part of the country's political DNA. And in that sense, the war never truly ended. It transformed. The belief that independence would unite Finland proved false. But another belief slowly took its place. That unity is not something declared. It is something built, carefully, reluctantly, together. Finland learned that lesson the hard way, and it carried it forward, quietly shaping every crisis that followed. The Civil War was not supposed to happen after independence. That belief was wrong. But the belief that Finland could not recover from it was wrong too. What emerged was not a perfect nation, but a cautious one. A nation aware of its own breaking point. And in that awareness, Finland found a form of strength that declarations alone could never provide.